Emily Dawson couldn't ignore the intimidating grandeur of the Winston estate as she drove up the winding road that led to the imposing mansion. The estate seemed to stretch endlessly, surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens and tall, ancient oaks that had likely witnessed generations of the Winston family. As Emily approached, the sight of the mansion's tall, columned facade looming against the overcast sky sent a chill down her spine. She tried to focus on her task, reminding herself that she was here for professional reasons, yet the weight of the place pressed down on her with every passing moment. A few days ago, she had been approached with an offer to care for Harold Winston, the elderly father of Alexander Winston, a prominent and wealthy businessman. The Winston name wasn't unfamiliar to Emily. It held a reputation of power, wealth, and perhaps a little scandal that swirled around in hushed conversations whenever the townsfolk spoke of them. But nothing in those rumors or casual mentions could prepare her for the reality of being at the estate. It was a place that held stories within its walls, stories she hadn't yet uncovered but could almost sense lurking behind the large, intricately carved doors. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself as she parked her modest car next to the mansion's entrance. The mansion's doors were opened by a middle-aged butler with a stiff formality who introduced himself as Thomas. His manner was that of someone who had been in service for years, possibly decades, to the Winstons. Thomas's face held no emotion, merely professionalism, as he led Emily into the vast entrance hall. The marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and large paintings adorned the walls, depicting generations of Winstons who had once walked these halls. Emily felt like a small figure in a grand play, a newcomer in a world where old money and deep-rooted traditions held sway. Thomas guided Emily through the hallways with efficient strides, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. He paused at an ornate double door and opened it with a gentle knock. As she entered, Emily saw a figure standing by a large window that overlooked the gardens, a man with broad shoulders and a poised stance. He turned to face her, and she was met with the gaze of Alexander Winston, the man whose reputation seemed to precede him everywhere he went. Alexander's demeanor was one of cold elegance. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, were as distant as the ocean horizon on a cloudy day. He didn't offer much beyond a formal nod and a polite but perfunctory greeting. He informed her of his father's condition and the routine she was to follow, his voice steady and controlled, betraying no hint of warmth or personal connection. Emily sensed that the mansion wasn't the only thing built with high walls. Alexander had his own fortress around him, and she had no illusions about being let in any time soon. Emily found herself in a richly decorated guest room, designated as her living quarters during her stay. She began to unpack, her mind racing to adjust to her new surroundings. There was a sense of unease in the air, an undercurrent she couldn't quite place. Emily had always prided herself on her ability to read a room, to sense the emotions simmering beneath the surface, and something in this house felt unsettled, as if ghosts from the past were waiting just around the corner. As she continued unpacking, a framed photograph on the bookshelf caught her attention. The silver frame was old but well kept, its edges engraved with delicate floral patterns. In the photograph was a woman in her early 20s, smiling warmly. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The woman looked so familiar that Emily felt an inexplicable rush of emotion, of recognition. She picked up the photograph with trembling hands. It was impossible to mistake those eyes, the curve of that smile. It was her mother, Hannah Dawson, looking back at her, frozen in time. Emily's mind raced, confusion and disbelief mingling with an overwhelming sense of dread. She felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Why would her mother's picture be here? in this house, among the possessions of the Winston family? What connection did her mother have to this place, to these people? The photograph unlocked a floodgate of questions. She couldn't reconcile the image of her mother, a kind, loving woman who had raised her with warmth and integrity, with the opulence and mystery of this mansion. Her mother had never spoken of the Winstons or hinted at a past connected to this place. Emily felt as if she had stumbled upon a secret, something her mother had deliberately kept hidden. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Thomas entered, informing her that dinner would be served shortly. Emily nodded absent-mindedly, placing the photograph back on the shelf, her mind still reeling. As she made her way to the dining room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion held more than just memories. It held secrets, and she was now part of them. Dinner was a quiet, formal affair. Harold Winston was too ill to leave his room, and so it was just Emily and Alexander seated at the grand dining table. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken words and a tension Emily couldn't quite define. After several minutes of quiet, Emily couldn't hold back any longer. She carefully broached the subject of the photograph, choosing her words with deliberate caution. "Mr. Winston," she began hesitantly, "I couldn't help but notice a photograph in the room I was given, a photograph of a woman who looks like my mother, Hannah Dawson." Alexander looked up from his meal, his eyes narrowing slightly as if gauging her intentions. There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his voice was quieter, less composed. "Yes, I remember Hannah," he said, almost as if tasting the name, weighing its significance in this context. "She used to work here as a housekeeper." Emily felt her pulse quicken. There was a connection, and Alexander seemed to know more than he was letting on. She pushed forward, despite her nerves. "I don't understand. My mother never mentioned working here or having any connection to your family." Alexander's expression hardened, a shadow crossing his features. "Hannah was, important to this family, but she left abruptly. I'm not sure why she never told you. Perhaps she wanted to forget this place." There was something in the way he said those words, a bitterness laced with regret, that made Emily realize there was much more to the story than he was revealing. She pressed him for more, her voice trembling slightly. "My mother never spoke of this place or the Winstons. I feel like I'm missing a part of her life, a part that's tied to this house." Alexander's gaze softened for a brief moment, as if he could sense her confusion and turmoil. But just as quickly, the moment passed, and his guarded demeanor returned. "Some stories are better left in the past, Miss Dawson," he said, his voice cool and distant once more, "especially in this house." The conversation ended there, but Emily's determination only grew. There was a connection between her mother and the Winstons, a connection shrouded in secrecy and pain. And no matter how hard Alexander tried to bury it, Emily knew she couldn't let it rest. Not until she uncovered the truth of her mother's past and the reasons why her photograph was in this mansion. That night, as Emily lay in her bed, unable to sleep, her mind was a whirlwind of questions and suspicions. She felt like she was on the edge of something life-altering, standing before a door that had been locked for years. And now that she had the key, there was no turning back. The secrets of the Winston mansion weren't just going to remain whispers in the dark, they were becoming part of Emily's life, and she was determined to confront whatever truths lay hidden in its walls. After learning that her mother, Hannah Dawson, had a connection to the Winston family, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. It wasn't just about the photograph. It was the uneasy realization that her mother's life had a chapter she was completely unaware of. A sense of urgency and betrayal fueled her determination to uncover what really happened all those years ago. Even as she carried out her duties caring for Harold Winston, the questions gnawed at her, growing louder with each passing day. She tried to focus on her work, pushing aside the lingering discomfort. But each interaction with Alexander became an unspoken exchange, each moment between them weighed down by the secrets Emily felt still clung to the walls of this mansion. Alexander's guarded demeanor and clipped responses only made her more certain that the truth lay somewhere deeper within the family history. Her instincts as a nurse had always driven her to understand and fix what was broken. And now, those instincts told her that there was a broken story within the Winstons, one that involved her mother. Determined to press Alexander further, Emily waited for the right moment. One evening, after finishing her duties, she found Alexander alone in the drawing room, sitting by a dying fire. He seemed lost in thought, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping the edge of a glass of whiskey. The flickering light cast a soft glow on his features, making him look younger, almost vulnerable. Emily approached cautiously, not wanting to startle him, but knowing she couldn't delay this conversation any longer. "Alexander," she began softly, breaking the silence. He glanced up, his expression neutral, but his eyes betraying a sense of weariness. "I need to understand what really happened between my mother and your family. I need to know why she left this place and why she kept it a secret from me." Alexander didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the flames. Emily could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes, a man trying to decide whether to let someone into a part of his life he had long buried. Finally, he set his glass down and turned to face her. "It wasn't my choice to have her leave," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of regret. "Hannah was more than just a housekeeper. She was someone I cared deeply about. Someone who understood me in a way no one else in this house ever did. We were close, too close in my father's eyes." Emily felt a pang in her chest as Alexander spoke. Hearing her mother described this way, as someone who had held a significant place in this grand house, felt surreal. Her mother had always been a constant, steady figure in her life, the embodiment of strength and kindness. To think of her as a young woman caught in a situation like this was difficult to comprehend. "Why did she leave then?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander's expression hardened, the bitterness returning. "My father," he said with clear disdain. "He was always concerned with the family's legacy, its reputation. He couldn't bear the idea of me being involved with someone he deemed beneath us. When he found out about us, he gave Hannah an ultimatum: leave quietly or face consequences that would ruin not just her, but her entire family." The revelation hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She had always known her mother was a strong woman, but the idea of her being forced to make such a decision under such pressure was heart-wrenching, and the fact that it had been kept hidden from her all these years only deepened the wound. "What consequences?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. "What could he have done to her?" Alexander's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. He had power, connections. He could have made it impossible for her to find work, ruined her reputation. He knew how to manipulate people to get what he wanted. I tried to fight him, but he was relentless. In the end, Hannah chose to protect you and your future, Emily. The room fell silent, the only sound being the soft crackling of the fire. Emily felt a mix of emotions, anger at Harold's manipulation, sorrow for her mother's sacrifice, and a sense of guilt for having judged her without knowing the full story. But even now, there was a missing piece. A confrontation that needed to happen, not with Alexander, but with the man who had forced her mother to leave. "Does Harold know that I'm Hannah's daughter?" Emily asked, her voice barely steady. Alexander hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I don't think he ever connected the dots. He's not in a state to piece together much these days." Emily's resolve hardened. She needed to hear the truth from Harold himself, even if it meant confronting a frail old man. She needed closure, not just for herself, but for her mother's memory. The following day, Emily made her way to Harold's room. The air was heavy with the smell of old books and medicine, a scent she was familiar with in her line of work. Harold lay in bed, his frail body almost swallowed by the oversized bed frame. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, were now clouded with age and illness. But there was still a hint of awareness in them, a spark that seemed to flicker when he noticed her presence. Emily sat down beside him, gathering her courage. She had faced difficult conversations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a patient. This was the man who had played a pivotal role in her mother's past. "Mr. Winston," she began, her voice firm but respectful. "There's something I need to ask you about. It's about my mother, Hannah Dawson." The name seemed to trigger something in Harold's mind. His eyes widened slightly and his fingers twitched against the bedspread. Emily saw a flash of recognition, of memories surfacing, and she pressed on. "You forced her to leave this house," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "You gave her no choice but to walk away from her life, from everything she had here. I need to know why." Harold's expression shifted from surprise to something darker, a mix of regret and defensiveness. He didn't respond immediately, as if weighing whether to speak at all. But as the silence stretched on, he seemed to surrender to the inevitability of the truth. "I did what I thought was right," he said slowly, his voice a raspy whisper. "I had to protect my family's name, our legacy. You don't understand. She was not suitable." "Not suitable?" Emily echoed, her voice rising with disbelief. "You destroyed her life because of some misguided notion of suitability? She wasn't just some outsider, Mr. Winston. She was my mother. She was a person." Harold's face twisted with something akin to pain, and for a moment, Emily saw the vulnerability in him, a man whose choices had left him isolated and haunted by his own actions. "I didn't want to hurt her," he murmured, more to himself than to Emily. "But I had to think of the future, of Alexander, of the family." Emily felt a surge of anger and sadness, but also a strange sense of pity for this frail man who was now confronting the ghosts of his past. "And what about her future?" she demanded. "Did you even consider what you were taking from her? From me?" Harold closed his eyes, as if trying to block out her words, but there was no escaping the weight of what he had done. His voice was barely audible when he spoke again, thick with remorse. "I thought I was doing what was best. For everyone." Emily shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "You were only thinking about yourself," she said quietly. "And in doing so, you ruined lives." The room seemed to close in around them, heavy with the weight of Harold's confession and the consequences of his actions. Emily felt an ache in her chest, not just for her mother, but for the years of secrets and pain that had shaped their lives. But even as she confronted Harold, she knew that forgiveness wasn't something she could offer. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. As she stood to leave, Harold reached out with a trembling hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice frail and broken. "I'm so sorry." Emily paused, her back to him, and took a deep breath. She couldn't offer forgiveness, but she could let go of the anger that had been eating away at her. Without turning around, she simply nodded, acknowledging his apology, and walked out of the room, feeling a strange sense of lightness. When she returned to her quarters, Emily felt both exhausted and strangely liberated. She had faced the man responsible for her mother's pain, and while it hadn't healed the wounds, it had at least brought them out into the open. Now she had to decide what to do with the knowledge, with the pain and anger that still simmered beneath the surface. That evening, as she sat by the window, she found herself thinking of Alexander. He had been caught in this web of family expectations and secrets just as much as she had. And despite their complicated history, he had become someone she could trust, someone who understood the weight of the past. Emily didn't know what the future held for her, or for Alexander. But for the first time since arriving at the Winston mansion, she felt like she had taken a step forward, a small but significant step toward letting go of the past and finding her own path. The atmosphere in the mansion felt different now, heavier and more reflective. Emily couldn't quite put it into words, but the weight of what had transpired seemed to hang in the air between her and Alexander. The events of the last few days had laid bare the wounds of their pasts, wounds inflicted not by each other, but by the decisions and secrets of their parents. Emily felt a growing connection with Alexander, a bond forged not through shared history, but through the shared pain of family betrayal and a longing to move beyond it. One evening, Emily wandered the mansion's grand halls, feeling restless and introspective. She found herself drawn to the study, a room that seemed to hold more history and memories than any other. It was there that she found Alexander seated in the large leather chair by the window, a drink in hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression one of quiet contemplation. "Do you ever get tired of this place?" she asked softly, her voice barely disturbing the silence. Alexander sighed, setting his glass down on the table beside him. "Every day," he admitted, his voice carrying a note of resignation. "It's like a weight that never lifts, a constant reminder of everything that's happened." Emily approached slowly, sensing his vulnerability. She hesitated for a moment, then took a seat in the chair opposite him. The room felt smaller somehow, the air charged with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Emily knew that there were things they both needed to say, even if the words didn't come easily. "Alexander," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I know what my mother meant to you, and I'm starting to understand what this place meant to her, and to you. But we can't keep living in the shadow of our parents' choices. We can't let their mistakes define us." Alexander looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something, perhaps reassurance, or maybe absolution. "It's not easy to let go," he said quietly, "especially when those choices have shaped your entire life." Emily nodded, understanding all too well what he meant. "I know, but if we keep holding on to the anger, to the hurt, it'll only keep us trapped in the past." There was a long silence between them, the kind that felt both heavy and strangely comforting. Emily knew that Alexander was wrestling with the same emotions she was: anger, betrayal, sadness. But beneath it all, there was a desire to move forward, to find a way to heal. "I don't know if I can forgive my father," Alexander admitted, his voice barely audible. "Not after everything he's done, not just to me, but to your mother, to you." Emily took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened," she said softly. "It's about letting go of the hold it has on you. It's about finding a way to live without carrying that weight." Alexander seemed to consider her words, his gaze distant and thoughtful. "Is that what you're trying to do?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Emily thought about it for a moment before answering. "I'm trying," she said honestly. "I don't know if I'll ever completely forgive Harold for what he did to my mother, but I can't let that anger define my life. I can't let it control me." Alexander looked at her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a silent plea for understanding, for connection. And in that moment, Emily realized that he wasn't just struggling with the betrayal of his father, he was struggling with the idea of letting someone else into his life, of trusting someone again after everything that had happened. They sat in silence for a while longer, neither of them needing to fill the quiet with words. There was a sense of mutual understanding between them, a recognition of the pain they had both endured and the strength it had taken to confront it. And though they didn't say it out loud, there was a shared hope that perhaps together they could find a way to move forward. Later that night, after Emily had retired to her room, she couldn't help but think about the conversation they had just shared. It was the first time she had seen Alexander truly open up, the first time she felt like they were no longer strangers tied together by fate, but two people who had found solace in each other's company. She couldn't deny the growing connection between them, a connection that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. But there were still lingering questions, unresolved emotions, and the weight of Harold's actions that hung over them both. Emily knew that their journey toward healing wasn't going to be easy, and there would be moments of doubt and pain along the way. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. A few days later, Harold's health took a sudden turn for the worse. The doctor who came to see him confirmed what Emily had already suspected. Harold didn't have much time left. The news cast a somber pall over the mansion, a reminder that the final chapter of Harold Winston's life was coming to an end. Emily continued her duties with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling the weight of what was to come. She could see the toll it was taking on Alexander, who spent most of his time by his father's bedside, even if the conversations between them were sparse and strained. Emily watched from a distance, respecting Alexander's need for space, but ready to offer support if he needed it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the mansion was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Emily found Alexander sitting alone in the library. He looked exhausted, the lines of worry etched deeply into his features. Emily approached quietly, taking a seat beside him without saying a word. After a long moment, Alexander finally spoke. "He's slipping away," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "And there's so much I never said to him. So much I wanted to ask." Emily placed a gentle hand on his arm, offering silent comfort. She understood the complexity of his emotions, the anger, the grief, the guilt, and she knew that there were no easy answers, no simple words of comfort that could ease the pain of losing a parent, even one who had caused so much hurt. "You don't have to say everything," she said softly. "Sometimes it's enough just to be there." Alexander nodded, but there was still a shadow of regret in his eyes. Emily wished she could do more, but she knew that this was something Alexander would have to come to terms with on his own. A few days later, Harold Winston passed away quietly in his sleep. The mansion felt eerily silent, as if it too was mourning the loss of its master. The funeral was a private affair, attended only by close family and a few trusted staff members. Emily stood beside Alexander, offering silent support as the final rites were performed. She could see the pain in his eyes, the internal battle he was waging to come to terms with his father's death and the legacy he had left behind. After the funeral, the mansion felt even emptier than before. Harold's death had left a void, not just in the physical space, but in the lives of those who had been touched by his actions. Emily could see the struggle in Alexander's eyes, the weight of the past pressing down on him with each passing day. She knew that letting go wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, one that required patience and understanding. In the days that followed, Alexander began to open up more to Emily. He spoke of his complicated relationship with his father, of the expectations and pressures that had shaped his life. And as he did, Emily found herself sharing more of her own story, of the mother she had lost, and the pain of discovering a hidden past she had never known. Through their conversations, they both began to confront the ghosts of their pasts. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt and frustration, but there was also a sense of relief in finally being able to speak openly, to share the burden of their pain with someone who understood. One evening, as they walked through the gardens together, Alexander turned to Emily and spoke with a quiet sincerity. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "But I do know that I don't want to face it alone." Emily looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. She knew that their journey was far from over, that there would be more challenges to face and more wounds to heal. But she also knew that they had both come too far to turn back now. "Neither do I," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood in silence for a moment, the world around them feeling both vast and intimate at the same time. It wasn't a grand declaration of love or a promise of a perfect future. It was simply an acknowledgement of the connection they had found in each other and a willingness to face whatever came next together. The days passed, and the mansion slowly began to change. Alexander made the decision to sell the estate, recognizing that it held too many painful memories and reminders of a past dominated by secrets and regrets. Emily supported his decision, knowing that it was a necessary step in moving forward. As the day of their departure approached, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The mansion had been the setting for so much pain and discovery, but it had also been the place where she had found a sense of belonging and a connection that had become more meaningful than she could have ever imagined. On the day they left, Emily and Alexander stood together at the entrance of the mansion, taking one last look at the place that had changed their lives. There was a sense of closure, of leaving behind the weight of their family's legacies and the scars that had shaped them. "Are you ready?" Alexander asked, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Emily took a deep breath, feeling a sense of both sadness and relief. "Yes," she replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. And with that, they turned and walked away from the mansion, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into a new beginning, one that they would define for themselves, free from the burdens of their family's choices and ready to embrace whatever the future held. As Emily and Alexander drove away from the mansion, there was a silence between them that felt different from any they had shared before. It wasn't the silence of secrets or unspoken pain. It was the quiet of something coming to an end and something new beginning. Emily glanced back at the mansion through the rearview mirror, watching as it slowly receded into the distance. The place that had held so many mysteries and so much heartache now seemed smaller, almost insignificant in the grander scheme of their lives. They travelled in near silence, the occasional hum of the engine and the rhythmic passing of trees creating a kind of meditative lull. Emily felt a mixture of emotions, relief, sadness, and an underlying current of hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. For so long, she had been weighed down by questions about her mother's past and the burden of family secrets. Now, as they left the mansion behind, she felt like she was shedding an old skin, stepping into a new chapter of her life. When they reached the small town at the edge of the estate, Alexander pulled over to a scenic overlook that gave them a clear view of the sprawling land below. He turned off the engine and leaned back in his seat, staring out at the horizon with a pensive expression. Emily followed his gaze, taking in the rolling hills and the distant outline of the mansion, barely visible in the evening light. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if things had been different?" Alexander asked, his voice soft and contemplative. "If our parents had made different choices, if they hadn't kept so many secrets?" Emily thought about his question for a moment, considering all the what-ifs and could-have-beens. It was easy to get lost in the possibilities of a different past, to imagine a life where their parents hadn't made the decisions that had led to so much pain and confusion. But as she looked at Alexander, she realized that dwelling on those what-ifs wouldn't change anything. It would only keep them tied to a past they couldn't rewrite. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice steady and honest. "But I also know that if things had been different, we might not be here right now. We might not have found each other." Alexander turned to look at her, a small, grateful smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You're right," he said quietly. "We can't change the past, but we can decide what we want our future to be." For the first time in what felt like ages, Emily felt a sense of clarity about her life and her choices. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she didn't have to face it alone. She and Alexander had both been shaped by their families' legacies, but now they had the chance to define their own lives, to create their own story. After a few moments of shared silence, Alexander started the car again, and they continued down the road, leaving the past behind them with each passing mile. Over the following weeks, Emily and Alexander found themselves adjusting to a new rhythm of life. Alexander, no longer burdened by the responsibilities of managing the estate, was free to explore new possibilities for his future. He had spent so many years living in the shadow of his father's expectations and the weight of the family legacy that he had never considered what he truly wanted for himself. Now, for the first time in his life, he was beginning to discover who he was beyond the walls of the mansion. Emily, too, felt a sense of freedom that was both exhilarating and unfamiliar. For so long, she had been defined by her role as a caretaker, by the unanswered questions about her mother's past. Now those questions had been answered, and the secrets that had once held her captive no longer had power over her. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to live her life fully and without the weight of the past holding her back. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch of a small cottage they had rented in a nearby village, Alexander turned to Emily with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about what I want to do next," he said, his voice steady and confident. "I don't want to continue running the family business. It's never been my passion. But I do want to do something meaningful, something that feels like it belongs to me." Emily listened quietly, sensing the significance of what he was saying. She had seen how much Alexander had struggled with the expectations placed on him by his father, how he had been torn between duty and his own desires. Hearing him speak so openly about what he wanted for his life felt like a moment of transformation. "What do you have in mind?" she asked, genuinely curious. Alexander took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about using some of the money from the sale of the estate to start a foundation," he explained. "A foundation that supports people who have been affected by family expectations, by legacies they didn't choose for themselves, people like us." Emily felt a surge of admiration for him, for his courage and his willingness to turn his experiences into something positive. "That sounds like an incredible idea," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You could make a real difference in people's lives." Alexander smiled, looking both relieved and determined. "It feels like the right thing to do," he said. "Like a way to honor the people we've lost and to help others find their own paths." As they continued to talk about the future and the possibilities that lay ahead, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. For so long, she had been searching for answers, trying to make sense of her mother's past and her own place in the world. Now she was beginning to see that the answers she had found were not the end of her journey, but the beginning of something new. A few weeks later, Alexander officially launched the foundation, and Emily joined him as a partner in the venture. Together they began to build something meaningful, something that was born not out of obligation or guilt, but out of a shared desire to help others find their way. The work was challenging, but it was also deeply fulfilling, and it gave them both a sense of purpose that they hadn't felt in a long time. Through their work, Emily and Alexander met people from all walks of life, people who had struggled with the weight of family expectations, who had been shaped by the choices of others, and who were searching for a way to move forward. They listened to their stories, offered support, and helped them find the courage to define their own futures. And in doing so, they found a sense of healing and closure for themselves as well. One day, as they sat together in the foundation's office, Alexander turned to Emily with a look of quiet determination. "You know," he said, "we've spent so much time helping others find their path, but I think it's time we started thinking about our own future." Emily looked at him, her heart beating a little faster. She knew what he was hinting at, and she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander reached for her hand, his fingers gently intertwining with hers. "I mean us," he said simply. "I don't want to keep holding back, wondering what might happen. I want to build a future with you, Emily, if that's what you want too." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of joy and relief that she hadn't realized she had been holding back. She had spent so long questioning everything, trying to make sense of the past, that she hadn't allowed herself to fully embrace the present. But now, looking at Alexander, she knew that this was what she wanted, what she had been searching for all along. "I want that too," she said, her voice steady and full of certainty. In the months that followed, Emily and Alexander continued to build their lives together, both personally and professionally. They faced challenges and moments of doubt, but they faced them together, knowing that they had each other's support and understanding. They had both come from families defined by secrets and expectations, but they were determined to create a new legacy, one built on love, trust, and a shared commitment to helping others. As the seasons changed and the foundation grew, Emily found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. It had been a long and often painful road, filled with questions and uncertainty, but it had also been a journey of self-discovery and transformation. She had faced the ghosts of her past, uncovered the secrets of her mother's life, and found a new sense of purpose and belonging. And through it all, she had found Alexander, a man who had been just as lost and searching as she had been, but who had become her partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had chosen to leave behind the weight of their family's legacies and to create a future that was truly their own. In the end, Emily realized that the mansion and the secrets it held had been the catalyst for everything that had come after. It had been the place where she had discovered the truth about her mother, where she had confronted the pain of the past, and where she had found the courage to move forward. And now, as she stood at the threshold of a new chapter in her life, she felt a sense of peace and gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had found her own path, and she was ready to embrace whatever the future held, with Alexander by her side. And so, as the sun set over the hills and the world slowly moved forward, Emily and Alexander walked hand in hand, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into a future they would build together, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of new beginnings.